Hello everyone, today we talk about the Europeans of Asia, the Indo-Europeans of the East, the ancient spiritual traditions of Persia and India, in particular, that I still haven't made a video on, but even more specifically, their connection with Europe, obviously enough, and the authentic root of their Aryan character, fundamentally shaping the core, in fact, of the entire Indo-European spirituality carried by these people through regions such as the Caucasus and Ukraine to the world entire to this day. I haven't ever really dealt too much with these topics. Our Indo-European religious history is not particularly large. It's not even 20 videos, but I've seen that you watch this stuff a lot. So I thought that together with the series I started about compared Indo-European linguistics and mythology, that is probably going to be one of the most important pillars of the channel, because I have literally the space for tens of videos on it corresponding to all the phonemes in Indo-Europeans, as a matter of fact. So I think that will provide with an abundant insight on all the actual foundation to the notion of an Indo-European religion. I will talk more about the Eastern branches. Essentially the Iranians. I made a video about the Tocharians, and or at least their later polities for our sort of medieval Asian warfare series, but we will come back on those as well. So it's the beginning of an interesting time here. When we look at the Europeans, referred to as the Arya, that is to say the nobles, who frequently describe their deities and heroes with the epithet Ari, just look at the Tocharian frescoes on the eve of the Turkic invasion. So look at how they represented themselves, like Hari meaning blonde, and naturally being connected with hair pigmentation. I made multiple videos, including on the ancestral roots of the Romano-Italic peoples and how prominent in Latin literature and language proper these ethnonyms at the end of the day are. In the Avesta, the sacred texts of Zoroastrianism, the term Arya is similarly used to denote noble lineage. All right, that's what the fundamental meaning is, but it's, as you understand here, etymologically and semantically connected with more than that, right? And of course, we're talking metaphysics, as we'll understand this. We're talking a spiritual race, essentially, as seen in the Yashts 1387, where Aura Mazda bestows honor upon the Aryan lands, the lands of the noblemen. This is quite relevant because you immediately understand what's the imperial Catholic ethos of the purest and most ancestral Indo-European identity. The spiritual essence of a distinctly European and thus Western tradition resonates through Eastern texts that should, in fact, but be considered part of a great unitary spirit. All right, we can read this in the Rig-Veda, in the Upanishads, in the early Buddhist teachings. These are some of the earliest works we are in possession of from probably that Indo-European past. I made a video about the Vedas, and we explained how, of course, the literary tradition that was salvaged and quite meticulously preserved and studied and expanded during the centuries. In fact, it's not the, say, analogically, the quite primarily identical body of doctrines that the Vedas would have properly expressed, at least in those terms. There are already some circumstantial corruptions and sort of more Pelagian kind of influence on these works. But there is no doubt also that the core is robustly and unequivocally founded on that military religious culture, where the emphasis on cosmic order and heroic virtue aligns with the ideals resonating across all the Indo-European world. right, from the Atlantic to, in some cases, properly the Pacific, right? Because we think, by the way, that among the other things, there were lots of Indo-Europeans also in China. Some people go as far, naturally without evidence, because we can't document that essentially the foundation of China might have been an Indo-European thing, at least in a eminently political and imperial fashion, which may not be strange at all as a concept. We will look more at the Taoist tradition and what, as we've seen, could tell us about the same ethos, the same motives within the European culture. The reason why I say this is not much the fact that I need particularly to affirm that China was founded by Indo-Europeans, etc., but because we have on Schwerpunkt actually always taken on a universal view at our beliefs. When we talk about Indo-European theology, we can't but look at Egypt as well. We can't but observe in a comparative and diachronic fashion all what the broader traditional, the universal tradition really resonated across the world like, right? The Indo-Europeans are just essentially one major and dominating element at the end of the day of a global, in fact, wholly Catholic ecumenic dimension that somehow impressed the world more than the others. This is the reason why it's important to measure even how much this spirituality reverberates in particular cultures. This perspective indeed undermines the simplistic East-West dichotomy that is sometimes articulated in a post-traditional world, thinking, for example, that there is merely, let's say, a West isolated within its narrow confines. This is an anti-traditional ideology that was spread, in fact, after the end of the Ancien regime and by the self-referentiality of nationalists, statalists, in the sense also socialists, as a matter of fact, in the last couple of hundreds of years of history, that simply looked at their own piece of dirt and flag, completely removing this from any metaphysical spirituality. And it's not like to say, as I just pointed out, that certain cultures did not sort of water down and diluted thus some of the ancestral foundational aspects of the same. You can look at India and rightfully realize that, of course, something went wrong along the way. But not least, in fact, the fact that it got conquered by the British as a proper European people. But there is something disconcerting about this counterposition that is not much rooted in that conservative, in the liberal ideology, but also in the conservative one. Why I say this? Think about all those hippies in the 60s and the 70s that said, oh my God, this is so spiritual, man. And the West is so materialistic and whatever. It's, if anything, it was the other way. These were mostly communist Marxists. And so those are materialists by definition. And they never really fully understood that. But that level of low-key pseudo-spiritualism, of course, had nothing to do with the notion. Imagine telling that, I personally know some sort of boomer, in fact, 1960s kids, young adults that literally like, I'm reading something about the Vedas. Imagine that the Vedas were obsessed with racial separation, a rigid social hierarchy. They were in love with swastikas and preached the notion of taking over the world by divine judgment. This is exactly the version that is actually the most accurate and the most original version of these people's beliefs that somehow could pass into an allegedly literate society of the 20th century for some kind of, this is not like the bad Westerners that make wars, that are evil, that are capitalists, all this stuff. No, this is just, this were free-spirited people, were open-minded culture. So reduced to, I don't know, a communist brothel of lesser creatures of some sort. Of course, again, if you look at Eastern cultures, as I just said, something went wrong along the way. If you look at Buddhism, that was properly born as one of the most actually necessarily reunifying forces from literally founded by a member of the Kshatriya class, so probably the warrior ones, to reunite for the universe under that single dominance, turned into basically a polytheism truly intended in a paganistic sense that had nothing to do with all the Indo-European religions that were purely Catholic. In fact, a bit the opposite that Jainism went for, it stemmed from this more fractal substratum and turned into something more unitary paradoxical. And of course, aside from the fact that, by the way, also any other pacifistic notion is completely out of the way, because Asian cultures are some of the most hysterically violent and genocidal in the history of mankind. There was something that, of course, pertained to the pre-Indo-European substratum that, especially if we look at India, sort of ingurgitated everything that basically set foot in there. And there is all a reverberating theme, this also for other lands. Like if you think about the Siculo-Normans during the Crusade era, sort of looked upon with suspicion by the French and German knights in the Holy Land, because they had been dwelling in places populated by Muslims close to Africa and so on. You realize that there is something beyond this. The same goes for Persia. Today we will not talk about Persia that much. Of course, it sort of diluted a great part of its Indo-European dimension, but it's also staunchly separated itself from the Western, essentially Semitic world, and informed, for example, the same Abbasid Caliphate in ways that, I don't know, the North Africans were seen as some sort of chthonic Pelasgian magicians, as opposed to the more splendid heroes descending from the legacy of the kings of kings. So these are all things that I presume for an adult audience are kind of the foundation of their primary schooling, I would hope. But if this wasn't the case, of course, Schwerpunkt in part can help. All right. So the point is not much, for example, as some authors have done, counterposing, for example, a Christian West to an insidious Hindu world in the East. This was partially done, again, in an era in which also Christianity was basically separated from its Catholic, but definitionally Catholic background. There is no other Christianity but the Catholic one, just in case you want, in strictly traditional terms. This is not a matter of opinion or degrees, literally. Like, Christianity is Catholicism. If Christianity is not Catholic, it is not Christianity, and it's not anything in practice. And as very well, at least one of the few things that today even Catholic priests will teach you, because of course, like, again, anything can degenerate at every level of our society at this point. We're really living on the ruins of something gloriously traditional and Catholic. Is that Catholicism, in this sense, tradition predates Christianity. This is a very specific foundational Catholic notion, that tradition precedes Christ, and obviously refers to the Catholic world before this. Like in this, of course, like there are some priests that would have problems with considering that there is something that goes outside, but also in parallel, by the way, with the Old Testament in this universal picture, right? The same David's star, for example, was apparently Indo-European symbol, but again, belonging to a universal spectrum that is the foundation for any successful, not just religious, but in this sense, earthly power back in the day. And I think the Vedas in India also very well reflect that. So the point is not much rehabilitating the East as if the West had anything to learn from that, but simply realizing that Westernists are somehow merely even geographical terms. Right? There are lots of people in the West, and I've noticed it on Schwerpunkt, that fundamentally believe that there is an Eastern way to things as opposed to a Western one. This is a fractalistic, paganistic nonsense that has nothing to do with Indo-European Catholicism. There is only one unitary degree of measure, right? And aside from the fact that basically today the world is Western, meaning that every single country in the world is founded and is at least developed in its fundamentals as Western country. I mean, the Chinese are communistic. The general information that India received, of course, is Western, with English as an official language, and still on top of that, of course, an Indo-European background, which we should, of course, appreciate, together with, in the way it also blended with its local Pelagian dimension, because we very well know throughout our videos that there can't be a divine achievement without the transfiguration of the lower element, right? So what is naturally extraordinary about the Vedas is how much, even for a people that left practically no archaeological evidence, like how its cultural core impacted the whole system, just like in Europe, right? There were other people, many other people living in Europe before the Indo-Europeans, and we descend from them too. But our identity is radically Indo-European in language, in culture, aside from probably also the genetic information, but the broader essence of the spirit informed the entire continent that eventually took over the world. And it's also not random. Who follows me and my content in general knows what we're talking about, because you could see this just from, I don't know, Acratien de Troyes, chivalric epos, literary passage, as from this more comprehensive sort of looks at the history of Indo-Europeistics. According to the myth of the blood, the true determinant of this Catholic unity is the quality of the blood that flows from all across the world, right? And this was in terms of ancestors and spiritual, in the sense that the transcendence of life, the most important aspect. A view that highlights the shared heritage transcending any kind of spatial boundary, right? That's also why thinking that geopolitics is real, is fundamentally a mental illness, because it defies basically any concept, not just Indo-European metaphysical, but even just Clausewitzian strategical. And it speaks, if anything, of the inferiority of a culture. I mean, if you believe that there are just different parts of the world that can't be taken over because they all pertain to different fractal realities, you are the expression of an inferior culture. It means that your spirit is of a lower quality that does not deserve to take over the world. And also because that does not fundamentally understand the pure essence and power of the Spirit and of the Imperium/Victoria Holy Ghost that can take over the entire universe, not just the entire globe. Now, a brief analysis of linguistic connections reveals a profound shared heritage, notoriously enough, between Europe and India. We have seen this many times. There's an incredibly, as a radically extraordinary connection between Latin and Vedic, which is something that honestly is also difficult to understand in strictly Indo-Europeistic terms, because at that point you should try to make a history that unfortunately is not documented about the Proto-Indo-Europeans and which branches were influenced by which connections, that unfortunately we don't know. It's just like the Tocharians. We know that they belonged to the Western branch. As a matter of fact, as we separate the two main Indo-European groups, and they ended up, even further east than anybody else, more or less as a bigger group. And those are, in fact, very close to more like Central European outlooks. It could be in the second millennium BC. I made multiple videos explaining the parallelism between Agni and Ignis in Latin. It's also the sacred fire of Vesta, and why. Also, in our recent video about the phoneme Ag in our Indo-European languages series is connected with that. Today we'll briefly come back on that with Agni in particular. There is a very particular concept, the one of avidya, right, that is very easy for students of Indo-Europeistics to understand the etymology of. This one is the metaphysical ignorance, a bit what I described before relatively to geopolitics. As you understand, this is a privative A, right, like in apolitical, amoral. And vidya obviously stems from like the same Latin video, so properly vision, and so in this sense with the prefix a, non-seeing, because in strictly providential terms, the Holy Ghost proceeds just through your own divine view that molds the world as long as your spirit literally sees the world in becoming, as plasmated through itself. So denying this capacity, which is at the root basically of all also general universal religions, is exactly Avidian, right? It's something beyond apolitical, beyond immoral. It's properly unexistential, right? That is what is conducive to the complete loss of your existence. Similarly, we're talking here about, of course, a broader Vedic background, like the term tapas is instead also quite famous, the intense mystical fervor of Hindu ascetics, connected, as you know, with the Vedic Somas during the science, very much connected with the Latin tepor, which stands for warmth, essentially the heat, and which is indicated just like Agni, like the fire, like the same best as one of this divine force, as the most important element of sacred fire. The Vedic god Agni, thus revered as the fire deity in the Rig-Veda 1.1, aligns with the Latin ignis. I'm talking about this to show you how much these symbolism align. For example, the su-asti-ka, finds a parallel in the Hellenic Heuesti. It's the same etymology, su-asti-ka, Heuesti, meaning it is good, right? The solar, benign, apotropaic symbol of God himself. In the Avesta, and so it does in Vedic, by the way. In the Avesta, the fire god Atar, son of Ahura Mazda, this is naturally the Persian tradition, is similarly central to Zoroastrian rituals. Right, we should talk about the Iranians broadly meant, because, of course, like Persia was the civilization that wrote the stuff down, but if we look at other peoples, I just recently made a video about the sagas. Remember that there is all a proceeding from the Indo-European steps that created essentially the Achaemenid Empire. We'll talk about this in a while, and make a video also about the rise and fall of the Persian civilization through an Indo-European lens. The fire god Atar embodied in the Persian tradition the divine light and purity, Yasna 17. These linguistic and cultural bonds underscore a deep connection across Indo-European traditions. Centuries later, the martial spirit of the Mahabharata, written down, in fact, quite later, but still deriving from the oral tradition of the Vedas, mirrors in many heroic ways the Homer's Iliad, the Nibelungenlied. Naturally, you can say, well, we're talking pretty different times and places, of course. And in fact, also in Europe, that primigenial Indo-European ancestral spirit and vision was diluted over time. You have naturally echoes of the Rig-Veda resounding in the same, Homeric hymns and Hesiod's Theogony. If anything, we'll look at this stuff that are still, for example, very influenced by some more Pelasgian view of the world, but retain still the fundamental concept that in fact survived among the superstitious chthonic communities of the lower estates, because it was part of a shared metaphysics in this sense. It's not like there was a Catholic world and the fractal paganistic one was basically just severed from that. They understood to be inferior, as always, just like the communists, like anyone. That's probably an entire superstition crafted around winery, victimism, and inferiority, and that's why they are at the bottom. And they always remain there. And they especially like that shared the emphasis on divine genealogies and cosmic order, right? This is incredibly relevant, right? As opposed to the promiscuity of the great civilization of the Mother, the idea of the Mother Earth that constantly generates and swallows, again, her own children that therefore are without a name, without a linear view, right? For all the people who think, it's just Christianity that instilled a linear view before other cultures, before it was cyclical. No, the Indo-Europeans believed that the view of the world was linear, right? There were cycles in between, but it's not like the two things opposed one another. In fact, even the chthonic world was not stranger to this, but in this sense, identified its own children as worthless, and so basically recyclable to point that, and that's exactly how, for example, in Hinduism there is such a doctrine of reincarnation, which is it does contain an Indo-European concept behind that, which is transfigurative and involutive, etc. But it also is a bit the triumph of the chronic forces on the cyclical, sort of feminine, socialistic view of life, right? But the idea instead that, as we've seen in the video about Agni, the divine order, heavens strike properly in the womb of the mother to create the greatest force that will take over the universe. We'll come back on this now. Is all there and reach the darkest depths of that, right? That's why Romulus and Remus, the entire notion properly of a sacred royalty emerging from the waters, it means that there is an inception specifically. It's not merely the waters. It's the spirit that creates itself, but it is also connected, according to the Catholic Trinity, of course, to the Godfather in gravitation of the Mother, and in this sense, the Son rising through this grace, Holy Ghost, back to the Father, that are, in this sense, turning as three into one, right? Not the Mother, the Holy Ghost, of course, together with the Father and the Son, which is also quite exemplificative of what Catholic tradition still is. Now, there are some sources we could digress on. In today's video, I would like rather to stick to the basics. But if you want, you can check out the Homeric hymn to Apollo, number 3, describing God's role in establishing order, akin to the Vedic emphasis on Rita. I will make a video about probably the European concept of order soon, if you're interested. Now, dating to around the 15th century BC, the Vedas, with their oral transmission, illuminate the earliest Indo-European faith with a pristine, dawn-like clarity. This is what's most extraordinary about them. These peoples, as we've seen in the video about properly the genesis of the Indo-Europeans and the conquest of the civilization of the Mother, were actually just some of the ones that migrated later. I mean, Europeans, in Europe, the Indo-Europeans were already there from quite a while. But since these peoples expanded in some of them and managed to take over some of the most civilized places in the world, they were also the ones that in many ways informed this bigger system, and in their Catholically extraordinary achievement left this enormous mark, together with essentially the, filteredly speaking, the most ancient kind of Indo-European theological doctrine, right? Probably doctrinal body. And you can perceive this golden dawn taking off, really, just as the chariots of the European heroes of the steppes while reuniting this world and flying to heaven. The hymn to fire from the Rig-Veda exemplifies this. As it says, I revere Agni, the divine priest of sacrifice. This is in part an element of the separation into estates that, as you know, in India will put essentially priests above the warriors. But originally speaking, this wasn't the case, because Catholically speaking, that was all one. It's just like, I don't know, the first Roman kings, Romulus himself, right? Only later you have that split, and in different cultures you have sort of different combination of this. In the medieval West, essentially the balance will always be quite tonified to the whole system. It's not like in Islam, where priesthood basically does not exist. It was supposed to be handled by the caliphs, but everything disintegrated quite quickly. In any case, as we've seen in the videos about sacred royalty, Agni in this sense was also like the highest being. And so as a divine priest of sacrifice, it was also the word, it was also everything, right? And in fact, the Rig-Veda passage says, I revere Agni, the divine priest of sacrifice, the supreme giver of treasures, right? Which is the Holy Ghost, the Imperium, the Victoria. And the hymn, by the way, continues. It's beautiful. It's worth reading. It all says, Agni was worthy of adoration by ancient seers and remains so for those of today. You understand here that ancient seers here is understood as those who actually held the vision. And so, say, a person today might translate it as, you know, these ancient seers were detached from Agni. But the point is that Agni is the supreme seer himself, right? and says, may summon the gods to our presence. So divine powers, right, as de facto gods in this unitary Catholic system actually is. As on Earth, in this lower nature, of course, power fragments, and so the purpose is to reunite it. And through these forces, by the way, which is the theological point, through Agni, the sacrificer daily bestows wealth and prosperity, which brings strength to many sons. All right, the celebration of life augmentation, metaphysically, but also in this sense, earthly meant. O Agni, the sacred act of sacrifice. Agni is the same sacred act of sacrifice, right? Because it is what sets properly the standard, the absolute standard for any sacrifice performer. It must be as high as him in order for the sacrifice to have an actual effect, right? Which you envelop on all sides, right? So essentially a pan theological vision truly reaches the divine realm, right? Remember always the doctrine of the two natures. I made a pretty hefty video at the beginning of our series about probably Indo-Europeans that you should check out. To you, Agni, who dispel the darkness, we come daily offering prayers in homage to you who oversee sacred rites, the guardian of the radiant order flourishing in your domain. This is beautiful. Like the idea that from a center, the order reorganizes the entire universe in hierarchical clarity. It's a dominion. This is an empire, right? Be approachable to us, O Agni, as a father is to his son, and remain with us for our well-being. He is safeguarded by you, for him the rain ascends gently from the heavens. And Catholically enough, of course, the universal completion entails that Agni dominates the waters, right? There is not a separation between an Apollonian and Dionysian dimension. There is also another level, because there is not just the Dionysian path, by the way, but he's the one who dominates the entire universe, hence the waters too, that derive from the god Father, but just like Jupiter tonans, right? And the power of Agni, in fact, as we've seen in that video about the Ag in Indo-European, manifests as a thundering power that enters basically this remnants of the fallen world and permeates them and lightens them up. Your magic, O Mitra and Varuna, is fixed in the skies. The sun moves its light, a gleaming weapon, right? As we just said, the thunder, right? With rain and clouds, you veil it in the heavens, right? Realize how, in this sense, heavenly power manifests on earth, because that's probably the holy ghostly dynamic par excellence. Divine grace descending upon the glorious victor, right? Because of his virtue and deeds. By your command, O Mitra and Varuna, which are a bit, as you know, like the Dioscuri of the situation, literally, like they're the same figure in the Indo-European pantheon, knowers of hymns, you uphold the laws through the magic of the Asura, right? And by the way, Mitra and Varuna, as you know, are the Dioscuri in general are probably of different kind. One is mortal, one is immortal, right? And the sense here of the Asura is the gapping between the two bridges, like of the two natures. One perennial, heavenly, and the other mortal and human, right? But it can and must sort of reunite for the deed of, say, the divine spark that lays in all beings. And the Asura, in fact, in here mentioned is the breath, derived from the term asu, we will see this, the vital spirit, right? Which also is connected, of course, from the root term es, which means being proper, and so being alive by this accomplishment and valor. In the Avesta, Mitra is depicted at Mitra, as we want, as a divine guardian of truth and contracts, overseeing the cosmic order, right? The Asha, as seen in Yash 10, where he drives a radiant chariot across the sky, all right? This is particularly relevant because basically you cannot have, why contract and truth? Because as we've seen also from the Hellenic classical authors describing the Achaemenid nobiliar ethos. And there can't be, again, the golden glory landing on on a ruler if he even says one lie, right? Everything will fall down and he will be no more. It's obviously enough, only speaking the truth will grant you, as if in a contractual system, but something more than that, because it really augments a lower nature, and so creates further divine power in the lower essence. The Holy Ghost will descend on you, and in parallel, you will drive literally a radiant chariot across the sky, reuniting with the Father as the Son. At the heart of the Rig-Veda lies the foundational concept of Indo-European religiosity and European identity in general. The order understood as the universal logos, a cooperative harmony between divine and human forces, in order essentially to salvage the latter by their own merit, driving a ceaseless struggle against the downward forces, the ones that head towards chaos and ultimate exhaustion, nothingness. This order is the ultimate cause, right? Embodied in the Rita of the Indo-Aryans, the Asha of the Iranians, the Orlog of the Germans, and the Moira of the Hellenes, right? It's a struggle with the self, because, as we were saying before, you cannot basically triumph in heaven if you haven't properly used them by summoning them, the darkest forces of your soul, right? That's impossible. If you don't tame those, you can't rise. If you fear, which is the only cause of your mortality, you cannot ascend to heaven by definition and gain immortal life. It's just an oxymoron. In Hellenic mythology, the Moirai, the fates essentially, Clotho, Lachesis, and Atropos, govern the destinies of gods and men within the thread of cosmic order, like in Hesiod Theogony 904-906. This does not mean, however, as we were saying before, that was the original principle of it. These figures are some sort of they're not ineluctable, right? They're not even simply tectonic forces, but essentially they are the gradual rationalization of the idea that there are superior forces that drive the world, right? It's like the Thike, right? That would be the Roman Fortuna, that was initially thought to be properly the will of the hero, and so the will of God, and not just some overarching narrative that had already been written for you. There is, as you know, it's basically by the common era that this concept fully kicks in anywhere, right? There are just rare references exposed. That's also why Christianity affirmed itself in the West as a consequence, not as a cause. Also in Beowulf, you find, for example, there is a passage that says that sometimes, like, the hero can escape essentially some of his fate, but already among the Germanic peoples, this concept had sort of, because of the weariness of the world, the fatigue, the exhaustion, this enormous effort carried out and succeeded with Augustus, under whose reign Christ was born. So it was the peak moment, as prophesied as the golden age, partially reactivating between the bronze and the iron one to eventually head towards the age of the wolf. So while you have these kind of figures that are, we can at some point analyze the Moirai as also, they are present, as you know, in others, in Latin, Norse mythology. How they are, in this sense, like an example of the complexity of the world. That's what the weaving the thread actually means, is basically looking at how intricate the tapestry of the cosmic order is. And if you're able to untangle that, of course, you can weave it yourself. You can be the divine hero that will successfully change the fate of the world, right? That's basically the point of it all. Indo-European religiosity forms a third luminous circle radiating from a single center, right, encompassing the sphere of the God, the Son of God, and essentially all the heroes that strived for entering the ranks of the former. as probably the Indo-European doctrine of the afterlife affirms, with essentially the second soul makes it to defeat the second death, right? So the basically divine judgment, and enters in the echelons of the firmament among the ranks of God for participating in the battle of the end time, maintaining a connection with the somatic soul, that is the third, and with essentially the first one, that is no more, but it is meant to actually according to the doctrine of incarnation, effectively reconstituted in all its glory later. And this is literally a very straightforwardly universal Indo-European Christian doctrine, by the way, because everything will be saved, everything will be reconstituted, everything will be resublimated. And this is an incredibly beautiful concept. Again, I made a couple of videos about traditional doctrine of afterlife. You can go check out, right? And this tripartite order of typical Indo-European character, and of course reflecting the Trinitarian Catholic belief, goes in parallel with the concentric sphere of man, the race, and the hereditary property. This is incredibly important because these aspects do reflect the divine principle, the soul that animates that, and the de facto the chthonic element, that the somatic element, if anything, that remains connected with that, even in the lower nature. Which means, however, more fully, that everything belongs to he who controls it. All right, this is a foundational concept in tradition. Today, people have a strangely materialistically coined, also because it was a term used by the communists, like capitalists, right? The idea of capitalism is I will die for my property. Okay, it's fine for dying for your property to an extent. But if you understand, it has nothing to do with a term that was created by communists for stealing your property. There is no such thing like capitalism. It's just nonsensical Marxistic talk. There is just actual ownership. There's just actual control. There is just actual imperium, dominion, right? And that's what immediately emanates. It's not something that can be regulated. It's something that you immediately own, right, just by being, right, to the extent that no earthly authority can really constrain. If you are, of course, worth of the Holy Ghost, by your deeds you're capable of controlling and being powerful. There is no way to control something, metaphysically speaking, if it's really substantiated by the actual virtue of the individual. And this is also why this is important, because Christ, Buddha, etc., reinstated a concept of radical spirituality, right? That had to see this as a preconceptional element. That is to say, the focus on the perennial nature. Many people, who, of course, do not understand anything about the Bible nor about religion in general, think that this means, okay, so you have to reject the world entirely. In theory, if you want to come back into God, yes, but not in the sense that while you're on earth, you do not have to grow through what you have on earth, right? Hence, war, domination, the imperium is not antithetic at all to Christian teaching. Actually is the way to heaven, because it trains the fallen kind to reharness power and understanding truly what's, what are the first steps in the stairway to heaven. In Germanic tradition, the concept of odal refers to inherited land, for example, as seen in runestone inscriptions like the Swedish Västra Strå 2, emphasizing lineage and property at the same time. This is a very old and, quite essential principle of Western civilization. This frames the world in its orderly progression, with, for example, Sparta in Hellas serving as a microcosm of Rita, organized by a principle where the term cosmos, beyond denoting universal order, can also signify magistracy, highlighting the vital connection between cosmic and societal orders. Hence the video I made on the Spartans. recently, if you wonder, by the way, what kind of metaphysical measure you can take in order to explain what Sparta was what it was, and why lesser people today just see it as a socio-economical, deterministic, technologistic issue, rejecting practically any human dignity, morality, science, and just sticking to some lurid materialism and relativism. Well, just know that history does not have any of that. Things are, or they aren't, right? There may be a gradient in between, but there is no way to deny at which point of the spectrum this rests. The Rita manifests in varied forms, yet always with primal force, whether in the vastness of the cosmos, the cycles of the sun, the flow of rivers, the inner essence that may rest in the womb of the Rita, or as the unfolding of existence itself. So as we were saying before, you beautifully understand how the cyclicity of this world pertains just to this earthly dimension, that aligning constitutes a hierarchical stairway to God in a linear vector. So that there is no such thing like, simply a cyclical vision of the world for ancient cultures. Any person who has even a cursory knowledge about ancient cultures reads simply saying that they were just believing in cyclicity. There was no linear, there was no our point. Speak for yourself and open some actual book of history of religions, or even just study theology or this mythology if you just don't want to conflate the two concepts that are basically the same thing. Now, the Rita appears especially as fire, light and space, which is what we discussed in our recent video about Agni, that truly strikes, as we've seen, in the womb, right, of the lower nature, in order to render it florid, fertile, vivid, powerful, until this power rising, once again, bridging the gap with heavens from, and so saving the lower nature, with countless passages in the Rig-Veda exalting its glory. For example, Rig-Veda 3:59 praises Mithras as the upholder of Rita, ensuring cosmic harmony. Right, so this ritual cyclical dimension is belongs to those who exercise the sacred sacrifice, which is the sacrifice of the self, as we will see now, the self-sacrifice in holy combat, without which you cannot attain divine glory. And we'll see, especially now, commenting on the most famous passage of the Mahabharata, that we also, of course, illustrated in the video about the Vedas. So this is, again, very interesting, because the Rita, Mithras is the winner par excellence, because according to legend, he literally is born as a stone, so the most crystallized sort of nothingness in terms of life, but still, actually, as we explain in our traditional understanding of space, as much as it is something, it is endowed with a potential of life, and becomes the Son himself. So the Son achieving to the Father through the Holy Ghost into a plenary, trinitary unity. The Rita is the foundation from which the gods such as Agni, Mithras, and Varuna, in fact, arise, and the singular true essence to which the world's phases and creations perpetually return. So in other words, there is no... What does this mean? It means not just an eternal return of the equals of some sort of cyclical mechanism. You can see it in a metaphysical sense as much as what it is as a whole is, right? And so it is always true, it's infinitely true, it's repeatedly true. But it simply means that in order to for this to be achieved, it must be done in the only possible fashion, which is the divine one and the one of the truth, as we've seen. This vision of the order is thus dynamic, not static or passive, right? Because nothing can ever be the same after anything is done, of course, unless it's done by God. And that's the point. That's why there is a lower nature, right, that ever degenerates, and another one that never degenerates. It's how the last is lost, and or at least it's losing itself, but can revert through its divine spark to the form. this vision of the order embraces the multiplicity of existence where risks, losses, or wounds are nullified by the reintegrating wall, right? Goethe in Eins und Alles, translated, says, "The eternal moves within all. For all must dissolve into nothing, if it seeks to endure in being." This is a beautiful concept because it refers to the dissolution of the earthly dimension, the fact that everything shall pass, that this world does not belong to us because we belong to a higher nature, not an eternally degenerating one. And yet, for this very reason, the eternal moves within all. And we are the ones who have to perform this sacred union, right, with the divine. This is a beautiful concept, as you understand. It really stems from, this is of course a later, you see that at least Goethe, among his various, vicissitudes, had a pretty concrete understanding of some aspects, at least, of Catholic tradition. What we should stress, as a matter of fact, and we will see better, is the fact that war is fully embraced by the divine transfiguration. It is the place of election. My videos about von Clausewitz, I explained this many times. I also made a video about the Fortuna Caesaris, that, as a matter of fact, was literally an entire religion that Caesar developed in his life, given the necessary Catholic accomplishment that he would fundamentally achieve. The same Octavian inheriting this eventually as Augustus, but himself quite expressly making it about the Divus Caesar and his Fortuna. And not only, because the Fortuna must be chased, right, and tamed, so to direct her to your divinity. And Fortuna is Victoria herself, right? She is the Holy Ghost, she is the Imperium. That's how Caesar recompacts, right, the in empire of God, of the chosen people of Rome, for fulfilling the Indo-European evangelium. He exits the res publica and restores it under a divine auspicium. This perspective is, of course, contrary to what most people today profess themselves, like without any kind of morality, as so-called pacifists. The imperial Catholic tradition has nothing to do but with self-sacrifice in holy combat as the greatest accomplishment that a man can ever aspire to, right? Because it's the only way to return to divinity. And in the Mahabharata, as we were anticipating, you have perhaps the most beautiful motivational line ever, right? This is, we will, if anything, make an entire video or more on this passage at some point, but to make the long story short for today's one, when the warrior prince Arjuna hesitates to spill the blood of his kinsmen enemies, because at the end of the day, this is also a broader metaphor of the world, like the world, there's always this, let's say, a double-edged, literally, sword in terms of killing but without murdering, doing it so for supreme justice that does not take life away or out, but actually augments it through this sacrifice, right, such as this polyomia. And this turns out as psychomachia to a degree. Krishna, that is in that case the divine incarnation, as sort of an alter ego, at the end of the day, you can say even of the same Arjuna to some extent, but truly, in fact, as the transfigured soul. By the way, Krishna is black, right? Is bluish, like in all the. There are legends, I think, that you explain how this happened by accident, or at least never by accident, but in a way that incarnates exactly that lower dimension that you must tame and transfigure into the most splendid heavenly glory, right? By taming and possessing the female demon of victory, because femininity embodies that most chthonic dimension, but is also, as we've seen, the one through which everything is revived from, importantly enough, right? Also in the Indo-European vision of the woman, Krishna famously urges Arjuna to fight, right? To essentially surpass this kind of indecision, which is naturally in this lower nature inspired by fear, which is exactly as we've seen, the only cause why we are mortal and therefore defeatable. He urges Arjuna to kill or be killed, declaring, famously enough, quote, he does not kill, he is not killed. Weapons do not pierce him. Fire does not burn him. Water does not wet him. Wind does not dry him. Imperishable, omnipotent, immovable, eternal, imperceptible, inconceivable, immutable, he is called. This is one of the most powerful declarations of the doctrine of the two natures and of the perennial heavens that can even ever be achieved. Right, and obviously enough, he's talking here not much about simply, here Arjuna is not really, the motivations for his indecision are multiple, and they are deeply religious, not mere military, and there is also some fear, of course, of the ultimate combat, of what can happen. But the point is exactly this, like in the moment to which you go for it, if you go without any fear, you will triumph, right? Because only there can't be also an enemy who has no fear as much as you don't have. Otherwise, you would be one. There would be no enemy. If there is an enemy, it's always because there is an inferior that must be defeated. And so if you actually master your own inferiority and truly and fully embrace the divine order, you will become God and will triumph over everything and everyone. This is the most important picture of it all, because you will fulfill a broader gospel that will actually revive everything in the process. You understand how beautiful this is. And this teaching, found, as you know, in the Bhagavad Gita 2.1725, a key section of the Mahabharata, emphasizes the eternal nature of the soul. This imagery of the 1,000 fiery mouths of the Supreme Being into which human heroes cast themselves like a moth into the flame stands as a profound depiction of Indo-European resolve in the face of destiny. Right? Never think in this sense that Christianity or Christian Catholicism is any less than that, right? When passages from the Nibelungenlied were being rewritten in the 12th century, we're talking the same age of Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, of the Templar order, self-sacrifice in holy combat. It's the same identical heart from Arjuna to the Templars. The steadfastness appears everywhere. Right? In the Nibelungenlied, for example, that we just mentioned, where heroes like Siegfried face their fates with unyielding courage, you can appreciate that there is this spirit of, again, this was written, as we explained before, almost half of a millennium after the Common Era, discussing, Attila, Ezio's, like the fate of the Burgundians, make multiple videos on them, but it's it actually does provide the metaphysical transparency of the ultimate sacrifice into the bloodbath at Vienna's court, right? With brothers, the sacred brotherhoods of warriors drink each other's blood into divine unity to survive the flames, as de facto the Asgard is burning in the end time. And so at that point, not even Christianity, in a fully Christian society like the 12th century, rewriting this ancient epos, had overshadowed at all, right? In Germanic mythology, you find equally the concept of Wird, which stands for literally the becoming, like werden in German, were akin to Orlog, that governs fate, but not in a passive fashion, right? In the poetic Edda's Voluspa, you have the Norns weave the destinies of men. And again, as we've seen, the Greeks had the same, the Romans had the same. But the point is that the hero, the vanquishing hero truly is able to dictate the world, right? And there are also other reasons why, indeed, this culture, every culture in the world gradually lost. But when we look at this day, the notion that they can make it through deeds, etc. Also, okay, let's not digress on more modern issues. But as you understand, the primal principle behind this is always there, is always clear, and it obviously, as always, transpires in the broader resolve and motivation of the song, right? Transfiguring and finding, like in this dimension, far from men and gods, the ancient text suggests, which is properly one suspended between the two natures and bridging them, like the Pontifex literally says, as an attribution of the early Roman kings, and Romulus would transfigure into divinity himself in a blaze, in a cloud. So it's all what we are going to see better in other videos. And again, this is the best conclusion. You know essentially what I was about to tell about why those, for example, in the Nibelungen you have the hero succumbing, right? It's a description of the temper of the world that had changed. Not because there was not the inspiration or the motivation behind this, right? This songs had been sung in the halls of all the great paladins of Charlemagne, of the great warriors that had still the idea that even going like that was nothing but at least providing them with a place in heaven, in Valhalla, for the end time battle against the utmost forces of chaos, to win. Right, so also the Twilight of the Gods is nothing but the prodrome for, in fact, the darkest of the abyss being present, so that, again, the sacred fire of Agni could strike into it and taking over the world. And this is all present in also Christian eschatology, and again, we will see this in other videos, but you know what I'm talking about. So I was very glad to introduce this topic, because I think I'm going to make more powerful excursus on this sense of Indo-European spirituality, mutuated from, as we've seen, our entire sort of linguistical, mythological, religious, historical background, of course. This is what Schwerpunkt is. If you're not aware of it, if you have literally never heard this stuff in your life, just be aware that it exists. It is exactly what it is, and it's ready for being used, right? That this stuff can make a difference, that the world can be changed, that we can obtain everything that we want if we only want it, all right? Together with the God-given right to rule over the entire world. Nothing can stop that. This is why only for today I stopped the video here. The struggle goes on. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time.